the United States, we institutionalize large numbers of children who have complex mental health and behavioral health needs. In Colorado, for example, the Annie Casey Kids Count data tells us that in 2013, we had about 2,000 children growing up in large residential or institutional placements. Nationwide, that same database tells us that we have currently about 66,000 children who are institutionalized at a cost of over $6.6 billion. I spent my life as a child psychologist and a mental health administrator trying to change this. My inspiration, my personal inspiration for why I do this and why I've done this in my life comes from my maternal grandfather, Ira Sickler. Grandpa developed a mental illness in the 1930s and was institutionalized in Pueblo State Hospital, a mental hospital here in Colorado. I want to show you a picture I'm very proud of. This is on the grounds of Pueblo State Hospital. My grandmother, my mother, my uncle on the right, and myself as a 5-year-old. Why I'm proud of this is I'm the only sibling in our family and one of the few cousins that ever met my grandfather. He was the hidden guy. Nobody knew about him. The family was worried that news of Grandpa would get out and it would hurt our lives. But at 5 years old, I insisted. I said, Mom, you are going to take me to see him. And that's the visit. Next slide. Here's my mom in the same visit, my uncle on the right, and my grandpa in the middle. Thank you. I'll tell you, in 1986, I became the head of children's mental health for the state of Alaska. Very quickly, upon taking that position, I was given the task of returning all the children who had been sent out of Alaska and put in locked psychiatric facilities and cared for there, some for many years. The reason Alaska was doing this was really twofold. One was oil was $4 or $5 a barrel. The price of oil had crashed and the state was in financial trouble. But the main reason is a study had followed these kids as they'd come back in the last 5 to 10 years from these facilities as young adults, and asked the question, after we spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on them, up to over $1 million in some situations, were they better? Right? Did they come back and rejoin their communities? The answer was, in the dozens and dozens of young adults they studied, they didn't find a single child that met a very basic definition of happiness, which is they had friends, they had family, they had people around them, they had a life. And the reason for that is when we treat children in institutions and we try and then bring them back to their community, often, no matter how good their program has been, those skills don't generalize back to their community. Often their period of stability lasts only hours, not days, okay? So the state said, let's bring these children back, and I was given that task. And we created a homegrown effort called Wraparound. Wraparound was a way to deinstitutionalize these children using a very different tactic. One of the things that happened is I decided, I'm going to go visit every one of those kids all over the United States before we brought them back. But what I didn't know is I was about to meet my greatest teacher, right? Let me tell you about Thomas. And of course, I've changed names and insignificant details to protect confidentiality. Thomas was a young man that from birth to 5 had a horrible life. In a small Alaskan community, he was physically abused, sexually abused, literally passed around a group of men like trash and discarded. At age 5, this incredibly disturbed young child was pulled out of his community by child welfare, put in a foster home of a single mom who quickly fell in love with him and adopted him, right? Her life went from bad to worse as this child acted out, and this feces-smearing, violent young man began to try and get away from her. And a lot of kids like this, who have experienced extreme trauma, they don't want anybody close to them, all right? You would think, oh, they'd embrace love. No, that's the opposite. What really happens is they're fearful of that. They were wounded by that, and they push everybody away. He got more and more violent. Eventually, at 2 years later, he burned her home down. and living in just, in chaos, she finally had to relinquish the adoption. Folks, if you've ever worked with people that have adopted kids and relinquished the adoption, there's a hole in their heart where that kid was, and that hole never fills. For the child, no matter what happened that got the adoption relinquished, they feel discarded. They feel unworthy of love. The next few years for Thomas, again, were brutal. Thomas began to bounce from facility to facility all over Alaska. Residential treatment center, group home, foster home, psychiatric hospital, medical hospital. He began to bounce all over the state, 18 placements in all in a 3-year period. And again, every time anybody would get too close to him, he'd do something violent or sexual, and he'd wake up the next morning in a brand new place where people didn't know him, all right? And the scar tissue just building up and accumulating, and just this kid getting tougher and tougher and tougher, and scars all over him. Eventually, he bounced out of state to a locked psychiatric facility on the East Coast. And that was when he was 10 years old. He lasted there only 30 days before being ruled too violent for this facility. A 10-year-old in a locked psychiatric ward, he's too violent for this facility. Then he began to bounce all over the United States. 12 psychiatric hospitals in the next 3 years. Sometimes they're a month, sometimes 3 or 4 or 5, 6 months. But every time the pattern would emerge as people get too close, he'd get violent. Finally, in his last facility, he pushed a staff person out of a 3rd-floor window. And this person was incredibly injured, and he was escorted back to Alaska with a 24-hour notice. I was just about to visit him when this happened, and I got the phone call, and instead of going to his facility in the Midwest, I flew back to Anchorage to meet Thomas. I walked onto the unit. He's in a locked room, of course. There's an aide outside the door. I said to the aide, I need to go in and talk to Thomas. I was there to design a wraparound plan for him, design something unique to this young man. And the aide said, you don't want to do that. And I said, yeah, I'm larger than your average mental health professional, and I'm trained in de-escalation and nonviolent, all the things, and I can handle it, just let me in. Well, he let me in. Thomas was about 10 feet away, and he came at me with a look in his eye that said, you're going to get hurt right now. Well, I screamed, and I've worked with kids my whole life, and, never happened to me before or since, but this panic right here, I knew he was going to hurt me. And the aide was watching through the little window in the door, and he quickly opened and said, told you, and let me out, And a day later, though, with Thomas in restraints, I was able to sit with Thomas and explain to him what we were trying to do. Really smart little guy. He figured out immediately this was different. He wasn't just being placed. We were going to try something completely different, and he got it like that. So I sat with him and I asked him what is the core question in wraparound, which is, what do you need to have a better life? Where do you want to live? What can we do? What in this now 13-year-old brain, what is it that you want? Thomas immediately said, without pausing, I want my mom. Meaning his adoptive mom from when he was 7 years old, when that adoption failed. He said, I want to live with my mom. That's what I want. And I said, well, Thomas, I can't do that for you. And I explained to him that in Alaska, if you've had a relinquished adoption, you can no longer maintain contact with that child, okay? And I explained that to him, and I said, but what we can do is we can put you with a family. He said, okay, I like that. I like that idea. We recruited a foster family who had a great deal of experience in living one-on-one with kids with extreme behaviors. They both had master's degrees in that area, and they came in and became Thomas's foster parents. As soon as they got close to him, though, the patterns emerged: push back, fight, violence, sexual acting out. They had committed to stick with this kid no matter what, but a year later, after 18 psychiatric hospitalizations in 1 year, they just said, we can't live this way anymore, and they left. Thomas went back to a facility, back on a ward. So I show up again, and I said, Thomas, I'm sorry about what has happened, but we're going to try again and wraparound. We never give up, ever. And I said, Thomas, what do you need to have a better life? What do you need? What what should we do now in your opinion? And Thomas just said, look, I told you a year ago I want my mom. I want my mom. I want to live with my mom. That's what I want. And I just said, we can't do that. We don't know where she is, and the state won't allow it. But by now, we were getting a little better at this, all right? We had half of the kids back from out-of-state placements successfully, and I knew better questions to ask now. So I said to Thomas, who have you ever loved? Who's ever loved you in your life? He thought about it for a while, and he named a psychiatric aide that had been on the psych units when he was a young child. And this aide always had candy in her pocket for him, and she and her husband would take him home at Christmas when the wards emptied out for the holidays, And I said, okay, that's cool. Let me think about this for a couple days. And I went out and tried to find that woman. I found her working in a medical hospital on the other side of town. She was about ready to retire, and I went to her and said, have we got a deal for you? and she and her husband became foster parents to Thomas. This by now, child was almost 14, and this worked, folks. It was the love. I don't know exactly why it worked, but I think it was love and structure and familiarity and, this feeling of connection to his community. He stabilized. Life wasn't perfect. I remember when he was 14, we realized this kid has zero skills in having friends. Living in institutions all those years. Often he would live on the streets, by the way. He'd run away from these out-of-state facilities and go on the streets, He just didn't know how to have friends. And we recruited a couple other 14-year-old boys and designed a plan where, he just learned how to just have a talk with another kid and how to go have fun and, and just do things like that. But Thomas is stabilized. He did quite well. He got caught up in school. He had a life. We had his 18th birthday party at the foster parents' house. All the teams, all the people that had been in his life over these years came and celebrated how well he had done. The next morning, the foster parents woke up and there was a note from Thomas thanking them for everything he had done. And Thomas left and went on the streets of Anchorage and became a prostitute, turning tricks for money. And, I can feel the emotion today of what we felt then, the whole team. We were like, oh my gosh, after all these years. But it turned out he had a secret life plan that he wisely never told anybody. And that what would happen is he would run away from these facilities, and who would take care of him on the streets? It was often the female prostitutes, okay? And he saw them as having status and money and prestige of some kind, and he had this plan that when he turned 18, that's what he was going to do. He was going to be like mom out on the streets, and that's what he did. And now we all got together and said, we're not giving up on him. We are not giving up on this kid. But in Alaska, prostitution is illegal, but the police just don't charge people for it, And so we tried to get the police involved. They said, no way. So we tracked him. We put notes in all the bars in downtown Anchorage and left notes for him. Whenever he would surface, somebody from his team would go to him and say, Thomas, hey, we're here for you. All you have to do is say the word. You're right back, just right back. He would curse and refuse and run off. We tracked him for a year. And then finally he disappeared. We didn't know where he was. We assumed he was probably dead. What had happened is he had been held in a man's basement, kidnapped and brutalized. He eventually got out, almost killed the man. The man, by the way, got life in prison for his crimes. But when he got out, when Thomas got out, he was put in a medical hospital. And because of the extent of his physical injuries, and he was in the hospital. By now, I was no longer doing the direct work with the children. All the kids had been back from out of state. I had been reassigned into other duties. But his team leader, his wraparound team leader, showed up at the hospital and went into his room and sat down with him and just said, Thomas, I'm so sorry what has happened here. But I just need to ask you, what do you need? Where do you want to live? What do you need to have a better life? And folks, anybody tell me what he said? You got it, And again, I can just feel this here 30 years later, it's like, wow, But the reality is, that's what he said. Here's what this wonderful woman did. She said, okay, you're now an adult. And by the way, the restrictions don't apply anymore. I don't know where she is. Nobody knows where she is. But would you agree, while you heal, if we go try and find her? The woman walked out of the hospital room, went down to the lobby, got a phone book, and she was in the phone book. Called her up and said, hey, this is the situation. What's going on? You remember Thomas? Blah, blah, blah. Woman just interrupted her and said, where are you at right now? 20 minutes later, the team leader walked into Thomas's hospital room with Thomas's mom. And you just go, wow, I would have given anything to have seen that, to have been there for that. But the reality is that triggered a whole set of things that led to some real healing for this young man. What happened for him, and again, I'm sorry for the emotion, but if I can't get emotional in front of you all, where can I get emotional, But what happened is Thomas felt this incredible sense of relief. He felt this place of community. He was with his mom. What happened is we began to plan for them. Now, both of them wanted the same thing, which was Thomas's childhood back. That was impossible. That was never going to happen. What they did in the wraparound plan, again, highly individualized, whatever it takes, they rented a duplex. Mom was on one side, Thomas on the other, so two adults living side by side. A lot of support. They both got a lot of help just to make it through this transition time, a lot of work with the family. But Thomas thrived. He settled down. The next few years were amazing, all right? He just blossomed. Now, in reality, it wasn't all perfect. There were a few times he'd remember all the money he made on the street. He'd run back to the street for a week or two and make money, come back. But over 2 years, those periods got shorter and shorter in duration until they just went away, I checked on him when he was in his 30s. And at 30, he had not lived in the same duplex anymore, but he was living independently. He had friends, he had family, he had community, he had connections, he had a life, okay? So what did we learn from Thomas, right? What were the lessons I personally pulled out of it? One of the things is when we're privileged to work with and support and help our own friends and family, I think we have to do a few things. One is we got to listen to them. We got to ask them what they need. When we're with our friends and family, we start where they're at. I think the other thing that I learned personally is, we really need to change our system, the way we work with kids and families at times. What if Thomas's adoptive mom, when he was 5 years old, what if she would have had an incredible amount of help, respite and in-home staff, and what if she would have had all those supports and services? She didn't have them. She was offered a therapy session or two, but that wasn't enough. What if we had intervened powerfully as a service system in the life of Thomas's family there? I think we could have stopped all those moves. We could have prevented all that scar tissue from popping up. We could have really changed the system. The great Greg Dalder says, when we listen with every cell of our body, from our toes to our head. We listen, and we listen. We never give up. We stick with people. We respect them. We build community around them. That's what we do. This stuff works, folks. It's what we need to do with our most vulnerable kids. All I'd say at the end of this is, let's take care of our babies, all right, When we're working with our vulnerable babies, let's support them. Let's never give up on them. Let's wrap community around them, and let's just love the heck out of them. Thank you very much.